Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the August meeting of the Housing, Planning and Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee. You are all very welcome, but particularly welcome are the substitute members we have today. Councillor Tanya Birch from Salford, Councillor Ray Dutton from Rochdale and Councillor Fred Walker, a familiar face to those of us around this table from Wigan. All of you are particularly welcome and thank you very much for ensuring we are quorate today. Item 2, there are no chair's announcements and no urgent business to report. Item 3, does any member have any interest to declare for any of the items on the agenda today? I'm seeing nobody indicate, so that's very good. Very good. Item 4 is the minutes of the last meeting. Do members agree that they are a true record of the last meeting? And you're happy for me to approve those? Lovely. Just a couple of things for me to report back to the committee. You'll remember we had representatives of Northern and Network Rail come for a very interesting discussion about rail performance. We had asked as a committee for some information about the amount they had to reinvest into improving services as a result of delays and cancellations. They have provided some very interesting information, but not the information we asked for. So we've gone back to them just to clarify, and we look forward to receiving that information in due course. I've also been asked to remind members that you should let Susan know, our statutory scrutiny officer, if you would like to take up Northern's offer to visit the new trains in the depot. And you're also invited to submit signage suggestions to TFGM about Metrolink zones. So remember we talked about how passengers would know they were moving from one zone to another zone. If you have any ideas other than really big numbering and signs, do let TFGM know. I am pleased that Simon is here because we talked about GMSF last time, at this committee last time, and there has been a decision in principle taken, I understand, by the combined authority to move from a joint development plan to a spatial development strategy. Brilliant. And I wondered if you might just talk us through that, particularly around whether the constituent councils and council members will be required to vote on the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick update. The power to produce a spatial development strategy as opposed to a DPD, SDS as opposed to DPD, was part of the first devolution deal, and there was always an expectation that the GMSF would become an SDS. The reason that it's become an issue right now is because the regulations are only just being passed, and so this is the first time that the possibility of moving to an SDS has been able to be considered by the combined authority. As I say, it was part of the original devolution deal. I think it's important to stress that it was a decision in principle only, so no final decision has been made about whether we would go down an SDS route or a DPD route. To answer your specific query, if it was an SDS, it would be up to each leader of each council how they dealt with that within their own council. So that would be for each leader to deal with. And a final decision about which route we go down, because there are still some legal issues to be resolved. A final decision will be taken at the October Combined Authority when it looks at the draft spatial framework.
So for clarification then, or for my understanding, there used to be a need for leaders to take a vote of each council, and that need has now, or if the change is voted through and a decision is taken rather than a decision in principle, that need goes away and it's up to each of the leaders to decide.
The DPD requires the approval of each council, or the full council, to be approved by the combined authority, because it is a plan of the 10 councils and not of the mayor. The SDS is a plan of the mayor and the 10 leaders, and therefore it's up to each leader how they would approve that within their own council. Yeah. Sorry.
Just to add to that, though, it does require all 10 to unanimously agree it. So it's not the usual 7. So it still does require all members of the CA to agree it.
Sorry, Councillor Walker, hold on one sec. I will bring you in, and I've got other people whose interest has been piqued by this item, I think. So a decision in principle has been taken, and I think you said that a final decision will be taken in October. Is that what you said? Okay.
That's correct, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Walker, I'll bring you in first. Please use your microphone.
the name rather than the initials, will you? Because there's 20 million initials in GMCA.
Councillor Morgan, were you waving at me as well?
So an SDS, which is what we thought we had, would be each leader of the council making the decision on behalf of the council. Is that right? Then the DPD will be a full vote of each individual council?
Yeah, it would require the approval of each individual council, yes.
Thank you.
So it was the DPD and is moving to an SDS.
It was DPD.
Apologies to Councillor Walker for using acronyms there. Yeah. So there did need to be, under the old setup, there did need to be a vote of each council. If the decision to move to the new setup goes through, each council doesn't need to vote, and it's down to the individual leaders of the council how they deal with that. Okay. Anything else on this item, or Simon?
Just to clarify, just to re-emphasise what I said before, the reason this has become an issue now is because the devolution deal actually wrote in that we'd have the ability to produce a spatial development strategy, but the regulations for that have only now literally just passed. So it was always part of the original devolution deal, part of the arrangements for devolution, but it's only now become an issue because the regulations are now, say, moving through Parliament.
So really then, each individual council or council members, non-executive council, have no, under the new system, will have no redress or comment on the strategy?
I think because these are kind of legal issues, and I want to make sure that I'm not in any way saying anything which is legally not factually correct, as it were. I think it would probably be easiest if we brought a paper to the next scrutiny committee, or maybe even circulate it in advance to explain the legal difference between the two plans, because that would then give you the exact legal reasons and issues associated with each variation, as it were.
I think on behalf of the committee, I'd like to accept that offer. Thank you. And I don't think you need to wait for the next committee meeting. I think a note being circulated when you've had a chance to prepare it, I think would be helpful. And I imagine this may come up in the individual councils. I look at Councillor Gunther, who looks delighted at the idea. Thank you very much, Simon, for coming on short notice. We appreciate that. Okay, item 5 is the Greater Manchester Clean Air Plan. We have Simon Warburton and Councillor Alex Gnotis, who's the portfolio lead for this item, who are going to walk us through this item.
Okay, thank you. I recognise some faces in the room from when we last brought this to committee early this year, but just to recap, we are under a legal obligation to submit a clean air plan for Greater Manchester to the government by the end of this year. We talked about that at the last time this came to committee. The reason for that is that we have a number of sites across Greater Manchester that breach legal limits on air quality, and we are legally required, as a result of a court challenge, to put together a plan that will deal with air quality in those areas in the shortest possible time. So not a plan that will eventually deal with air quality or in the most sustainable way, but that will deal with it in the shortest period of time. And the steer that we've been given is 2021. So if we don't do that, we will be acting illegally. Now, when we last brought this to this committee, we talked about the strategic outline business case, which we had to submit to the government by the end of March, and we did. And what we did was we talked to you about the scale of the challenge in Greater Manchester, the specific sites in question, and the extent to which we need to improve air quality in those areas, and in general terms, what sorts of things we could look at to deal with air quality. We're now at this next stage, and that's the outline business case, which we need to submit to government by the end of December. And I do think that the issue of air quality will be the key Greater Manchester piece of work that we need to focus on between now and Christmas. And it certainly will be the biggest thing that I'll be addressing in my Green City region portfolio over the next few months. Let me just make the case that this is going to be very difficult for us. It's going to be very challenging. All of the councils need to work together effectively on this. TFGM are leading on this issue on behalf of the 10 councils, because TFGM lead on air quality in Greater Manchester. But I'll repeat the point that I made at the last meeting for the benefit of people who weren't there. Individual councils are legally responsible for meeting obligations on clean air, not TFGM. So if we do not submit a plan that is compliant with the law, we are individually legally responsible for that. And that's why it's very important that we come up with an effective plan, but that we do it collectively, because there's no point in a particular council dealing with air quality on its own, because your solution might be to push poor air quality to your neighbouring borough. And we don't want that, obviously. So I hope that you found the paper useful. What we tried to do was provide a paper that was as succinct and as informative as possible in terms of where we've got to today and what the challenges are for the next few months. I'm afraid, Councillor Walker, you will hear a lot of acronyms over the next few months, so we have put together a glossary to help you with that as far as possible. We will do our best in that respect. So we have this paper and also a presentation for you today. And in October, we are going to go public with much more detail about the scale of the challenge and what it is that we need to address and why. Now, it's tempting to think about this as fundamentally a transport issue, given what the focus of the impacts will need to be on, and TFGM are leading on this. It's actually not. It's actually a public health issue. And I'll repeat the statistic once again. We estimate that every year in Greater Manchester, 2,000 people die directly or indirectly as a result of poor air quality. And it's people in our most deprived neighbourhoods who are most adversely impacted by poor air quality. So this is a public health issue, not a transport issue, but of course the solutions will relate to the way that we use transport. So joined by Simon Warburton from TFGM, who's the Director of Transport Strategy, and also Megan and Mia, who will contribute to this discussion. And I'll hand over to you to go through the presentation, but obviously we'll then have a full discussion about what this means and take any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So in addition to being a significant issue for Greater Manchester, it's also a vexatious issue in that it's fraught with complexities. So what we thought would be useful is just to go through these slides first of all, just to help committee members to get to grips with the issues that we're dealing with, and then between myself, Megan and Councillor Gunther, we can guide through a conversation with the committee. So just to reiterate the points that Councillor Gunther has just raised, air pollution is a significant issue, and in particular is a significant urban issue. The proximity of communities and large amounts of activity mean that within urban areas we suffer considerably higher levels of air pollution than elsewhere in the country. There is now a large body of evidence supported by the health community that demonstrates the impact that air pollution has directly on public health and contributes to levels of mortality within the UK that have caused us to need to develop the proposals that we are now working through. And there's a reality that impact is not only an immediate social and public health impact, but it has an economic impact as well on the UK and on Greater Manchester. So the first difficulty is that air pollution isn't straightforward. There isn't just one form of air pollution. In effect, air pollution takes the form of two different categories of pollutants, both of which principally find their way back to road traffic. So first of all, we have polluting gases. They are nitrogen oxides. It's a heavy gas which in effect pollutes a very localised area around the particular locality, but then raises more widely the background area of pollution within an urban area. And alongside that, there are what are called particulates. So as an engine burns, as tyres roll on a road, there's fine dust that's created from all of that, which we breathe in, and which then irritates in particular the respiratory system in our bodies. The work that we're focused on at the moment, because the legal requirement is focused on this in the first instance, is around the first of those pollutants, nitrogen oxides, and nitrogen dioxide is in particular the pollutant that we're looking to drive down. Road transport in Greater Manchester is responsible for about 4/5 of the nitrogen dioxide problem that we have within the city region. So there are some issues around, you'll have seen various discussions around domestic burners, for example. There is a small amount of industrial background pollution, but really the problem that we have to solve here is a road transport problem. There are a range of directives that guide the targets that we have to meet over time around air quality, but the responsibility ultimately lies with local authorities, as Councillor Gunther pointed out before. Because we're an urban area where one air quality problem sits cheek by jowl to the next local authority's air quality problem, there was a decision taken over a year ago now by the leaders for Greater Manchester to manage air quality once over, and since we've been given the specific challenge by government to address a specific set of air quality problems here in Greater Manchester, we as TFGM have been coordinating that work. And just to explain, why would TFGM do that? Well, it starts with that reality that if 80% of the problem is a transport problem, then it makes sense for the transport body to deal with that. It's a problem, the identification of which is very much driven by analytical tools, which we hold on behalf of Greater Manchester, and therefore it's made sense for us to coordinate that. The way in which that happens in reality is I chair a group that's generally at around assistant director level from each of the 10 local authorities, called the Clean Air Steering Group. That has come together so far on a monthly basis, will probably from this point on until the end of the year come together on a more frequent basis than that. And with the support of Megan and her team, we then advise into that group and start to develop the advice that's then taken into each individual local authority over time. Different places have been required by government over time to develop plans to address the problem. And that in itself has not been the cleanest of processes. It's the process that we work with. But what has happened in reality is that government, first of all, was taken to task through the courts by an organisation called Client Earth. Client Earth secured through the courts a requirement for government to act in a particular way, and government has then organised itself accordingly. Government initially, at the end of 2015, identified a series of immediate locations that they're set out here on the slide to develop clean air plans. Having looked at the work of government, Client Earth then revisited their case through the courts, and in July 2017 a series of further places were identified to develop specific clean air plans. That was the point at which Greater Manchester was brought in. So we are working to incredibly tight timescales in terms of carrying out the analysis that we need to carry out to make sure that we have the right plan to address issues in Greater Manchester. and then developing that plan and taking it through all the appropriate processes of governance. More latterly still, a further Greater Manchester Authority, Oldham, was identified by government as having an air quality problem in only March of this year, and so Oldham have now started to work with us on specific problems that they are addressing. So, as I mentioned already, we have one way of working within Greater Manchester. We're guiding it, but ultimately it is owned by the local authorities. We have Highways England working with us on this because clearly the motorway network in Greater Manchester is a contributor to the challenge that we're facing. We have Public Health England working with us and the other devolved parts of the Greater Manchester health family. And we have, apologies for the latest acronym, Councillor Walker, we have what's called JACU on the slide here. That's an agency of government. Because this is principally a transport problem, what government have created is what's called the Joint Air Quality Unit. That's JACU. It's made up of a collection of civil servants from the Department for Transport and from DEFRA coming together to address the issues, and they're our conduit back into government as we develop our proposals. We've already looked to address the problem as quickly as we can. Government opened up a fund recently, and apologies, there's a typo on the slide there. That should read 3 million, not 1.3 million pounds, that we secured from the government's early measures fund. That was the maximum amount of money that we could secure from the fund, and we're currently using that to introduce a series of additional electric vehicle charging points around Greater Manchester, and we're doing work at the moment with the local authorities to put those in place. But as we look at the full plan that we need to consider, we have to develop our plan against a backdrop of specific policy interventions that government have asked us to look to. So as we develop a plan to address the air quality problem in Greater Manchester, we have to show that we can come up with a plan that solves at least as much of the problem as quickly as the measures that government identified for us to look at in the first instance. Those measures are based around introducing a degree of emissions charging. And the way that government has asked us to look at emissions charging is by looking at the impact of emissions charging if you extend it gradually over a greater array of vehicles. So we start with a Class A of vehicles, which would be some form of emissions charge control around buses and taxis. A Class B then includes heavy goods vehicles. A Class C then also includes light goods vehicles, vans. And a Class D would then also include certain classifications of cars. That doesn't mean, if this were to come to pass, that you would charge every vehicle within those classes. There are certain vehicle types, and a good rule of thumb to have in your mind is what's called a Euro 6 diesel vehicle as being compliant. Diesel is a considerably greater contributor to an air quality problem than petrol. Petrol engines perform considerably better, and to give you a broad rule of thumb, any domestic petrol car that was bought after around 2006 would comply with the kinds of standards that we're talking about. In comparison to that, any diesel vehicle that was bought earlier than the last couple of years is unlikely to comply with the levels of emissions that are being addressed by ourselves and government. So we've had an awful lot of work to do. We've commissioned expert consultants to advise us on this. We may be experts in transport, but we're not experts in emissions. And they have been running detailed feasibility studies for us. The feasibility study is focused on that core exam question that I talked about before around nitrogen oxides. Any plan that we bring forward, we will of course make sure also brings benefits for the wider environmental agenda in Greater Manchester around carbon in particular. And clearly any plan that we bring forward we will also need to test in terms of its wider impact on equalities, on the economy and on social inclusion within the city region. But ultimately our principal success factor that we have to test plans against is performance against nitrogen dioxide. And the way in which we will do that ultimately is by setting out the options in a business case that discusses the strategic problem that we're looking to address, that sets out an economic analysis of the impact of the options, and that sets out both the financial implications of the package that we propose to local authorities and how we would go about delivering those proposals. The proposals are likely to be significant policy proposals, and therefore we would expect that a substantial public consultation will need to be undertaken, certainly once, possibly at different stages through the development of this plan over time. The process that we're working to with government continues to shift a little. The current expectation is that we are required to have an outline business case with government by the end of the calendar year. If that continues to be the case, it's most likely that a public consultation would take place in the very early part of 2019. But we're not looking to set a firm date at this stage because there are aspects of the exercise that continue. What we also are looking to do and are talking with the public health community around at the moment is a public communication exercise through the autumn of this year, so that communities can understand the air quality problem clearer, because we perfectly understand, frankly a couple of years ago I would have been in a similar position, that at times it's difficult to understand the difference between a pollution problem and a carbon emission problem, for example. Our business case will allow us to apply to government for clean air funding. So our expectation at this stage is that government will support the financial impact of having to introduce a plan, and we're making sure that government is continually appraised on what the potential scale of costs could be in introducing any plan, so that as they organise their final budgets, they're not caught by surprise by ourselves and other cities bringing forward substantial plans. And the target date that we need to have reduced nitrogen dioxide emissions to target levels by is 2021. So from a start point of July 2017, we have to have addressed the problem by 2021. This is a very fast process of policy development. So here's how that timeline sets itself out. We started on this path July 2017. You'll recall, as Councillor Gunther said, we came to the committee around the turn of the calendar year and set out how we were approaching our initial outline business case to government. The outline business case to government, as went through appropriate governance in each of the 10 authorities, set out the range of options that we were looking at. It did not commit Greater Manchester to any particular path at all. We have more recently submitted to government a deeper analysis of the evidence base that they originally developed to identify the target areas. That suggests that the air quality problem is certainly not reducing as we look at the data, and could actually be at a slightly greater level than was initially identified by government. We're going through a refinement process of that, and if you'd find it helpful, Chair, at the appropriate time, we're very happy to come back and brief on the outcome of that particular exercise. And the work now has started in earnest around really challenging the options against the problem as we've seen it, with officers from each of the 10 authorities, so that as we get towards the end of the calendar year, we can take into appropriate governance within each of the 10 authorities the business case and set ourselves on a path to implement the measures by 2021. We're not alone in considering this. As I mentioned from the outset, there have been a range of places that have been required to develop plans. Just recently, for example, Leeds has undertaken a public consultation on a Class B clean air zone. So back to those 4 graduated classes, Leeds is proposing emissions charging around the central zone of the city for buses, coaches, taxis, PHVs and heavy goods vehicles. Birmingham has consulted on a Class D clean air zone. That's all of the categories of vehicle that are touched on around the central zone. And Southampton is also looking at a similar proposal to the Leeds proposal and is out to consultation at the moment. So just to conclude, where do we go next? We're completing that more detailed analysis that I talked about to develop, to have a final target agreed with government. We're currently modelling the options. There are some technical issues with government around the modelling process, which means that the outcome of that process is likely to run later into autumn than suggested on the slide here. I did say this was a fluid process. That's an issue that's only come up in the last couple of days. We are organising with public health colleagues around a public awareness exercise through the autumn so that this doesn't appear like a rabbit out of the hat when we get into the new year, and then we go into that process towards the end of the year that I've described before. I hope that's been helpful, Chair.
Thank you very much. Yes, I know a number of members have already indicated that they've got some questions. Just a couple from me, really of clarification. One is around public consultation. It says in the report, and it said on the slide, that there'd be public consultation if required, but you mentioned that you would expect there to be public consultation at least once, if not more often. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more around that as to what makes it required or not and what that might look like. And then my second question, I found this a really useful report. It's quite process-based though, and rightly it's making sure we understand how we get from here to there. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about what residents and what passengers will actually see, what differences this might mean to them in terms of the way they move around the city region.
So in terms of the consultation, were we to identify through target determination with government that there isn't a problem to solve, there won't be a need for public consultation. I don't think that's going to be the case. In terms of how will this change? Well, it is a little too early yet to speculate properly. I think what I can give assurances to members around at the moment is that what we are looking to develop is a package that means that whatever policy proposals we ultimately have to bring forward as Greater Manchester, we don't impede people's mobility around the city region. And so the conversation that we're having with government is to say, if, and it is only an if, we were to find ourselves with any form of charging system, as other places have been discussing, that we have to have compensatory measures in place for each of the communities who are impacted, so that there are either alternatives available to them to be able to change their vehicles more quickly than they might have otherwise been planning to do, or there are alternatives in place for people to be able to make the journeys that they wanted to make in the first instance, which comes back to the point that I made in the outset, that any plan that we develop will be the subject of that multivariate assessment in terms of policy impact, because whilst, yes, within the exercise in the first instance were focused on addressing a particular policy problem. It's not our intention that we advise Greater Manchester to pursue a policy that then introduces a set of real problems in terms of social impact, in terms of economic impact and so forth.
Thank you. I think Councillor Robinson was the first off the mark in waving at me.
Thank you, Chair. A comment and then a question. The demographics of all 10 councils are completely different and everybody has their own individual, should I say, structures. For instance, the Borough of Rochdale, you've gone from Middleton, which is heavily suburbs, to Littleborough, which is up in the hills and on the Pennines, completely different from each other. In the middle of that, you've got Hayward, which you've got the A58 that runs all the way through, and one of the busiest motorways in the country, which is the M62 from junction 18 onwards to 22. But my main question is around, on page 25, the different parking charges. For example, charging for car sharing or putting on a parking levy. Now, I've got concerns there because I know every individual council has their own way of working with their own car parks. But if you put a levy on some car parks in towns that have hardly any, should I say, retail, for instance, where that people, if they don't park free, that town will completely go dead, basically. So my concerns around your parking, any parking levy, we would have to deal as an individual town or as a borough, because every borough is different. But we put a levy on everything within the 10 councils. Some are going to suffer, and even some towns might even become ghost towns.
So, Chair, that's a really good example of the point that I made before, where the work that we undertake now has to have that that assessment that understands the impact from a range of different perspectives. And it's exactly those sorts of issues that we're working through with your officers at the moment within each of the authorities. I ought to stress that the shortlisted measures that are in the appendix that Councillor Robinson's referred to, they are measures that we're assessing. That is not a plan at this stage at all. What we've done is to identify those measures that could have the potential to contribute towards a plan. And the work that we're now undertaking is to review whether it's rational to bring different elements of those measures forward. And that sort of impact, firstly, the point, which is a very well-made point, that Greater Manchester is a diverse place, is something that we're taking very seriously in developing the plan. But secondly, for us to consider whether we would have a detrimental impact on the town centre agenda, which of course is a priority for Greater Manchester, is also something that's very much within our analysis framework as we start to look at the different options.
I've got Councillor Gunther, then Morgan, then Wilson, please.
Yeah, I'm looking at page 35 and I'm looking at the charges. You obviously quite rightly identified certain vehicles as the main offenders. And you also quoted some dates and so on. There are quite a lot of vehicles around before those dates. Is bad, for the want of a better word, bad engine emission, is this something which would be found during an MOT? If it isn't, then should it be? Right. And if it is, how is this reported? And also, how confident are we of some of the garages that carry out MOTs?
Okay, so the engine performance, there are issues at the margins in terms of do we all maintain our vehicles as well as we could do, and certainly as part of any promotion programme that we would develop around clean air, that would be something that we would include, in the same way as ensuring that when we sit at the street side, we don't sit with our engine idling and so on and so forth. In terms of the engine standards, no. These are specific standards that have been agreed over time between international regulators and motor manufacturers. And the latest standard of diesel and petrol engine is at what's called the Euro 6 standard. And the Euro 6 standard started to become the mainstream model of engine around 2015, 2016. So the specific in terms of whether somebody's vehicle would or wouldn't fit with a particular standard, it isn't down to how well it's maintained. It's down to the basic of the engine that's under the boot under the bonnet, sorry, in the first place.
I'm sorry, I was concentrating on this because I got in trouble last time I was here. Okay, I do beg your pardon. Did you say, in your answer, did you say it was part of the MOT or not?
No, it is. When you buy a car, the car is identified as having a particular standard of engine at that point. Yeah, it has been for quite a long time. It's just one of those details that when we're buying a car, we might not necessarily notice the same as other aspects.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Morgan, please.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. Obviously, this initiative started as an EU directive in 2008. What's the impact of Brexit? And the intent, hopefully the intent is to carry on with the implementation of this directive in the spirit it was meant anyway. Secondly, what impact do we believe that smart motorway is going to have on reducing the emissions, which has just been introduced? I have to say the journey in today was fantastic from Bolton anyway compared to previously. Now it's up and operating. And Councillor Robinson's question really, because I think that's the crux of it, is how each individual borough is going to be treated. Because, say, Leeds in isolation could introduce a charging sort of levy system to Leeds town centre, but we have 10 town centre conurbations, and to say implement it against Manchester and not the rest of us, that Manchester could possibly suffer economically. So I think that's the key, is how that's going to be treated. And then it's just a personal question. If your vehicle's got AdBlue, does that meet its EU 6, that thing? You know, when you have to add the emissions, the stuff to your engine. Somebody asked me and I didn't know the answer.
Yeah, okay. You may have thrown me on the last one, but I'll see whether Megan knows the answer to that question. Impact to Brexit, there is no impact to Brexit. The EU directive was enshrined in UK law a long time ago. And the smart motorway impact, I'd love to say that in September that journey through the motorway will still be as good, but I suspect it probably won't be. And yeah, it is interesting to note that we're in the middle of the school holidays, and the impact on traffic around the conurbation is profound, and it does show how it only requires a relatively small shift around our road system for it to perform considerably better. Smart motorways will make a degree of a contribution. Vehicles that travel around a motorway system at a steady 50 miles an hour perform better from a pollution perspective than otherwise. The government has yet to fully pronounce on what they see as the environmental impact of the motorway network, but we don't anticipate that smart motorways is going to solve the air quality footprint of the motorway network here in Greater Manchester. And I apologise, I don't know the technical detail, but let's take that point away for you and we can circulate an answer to members.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson next, please.
I've got three questions. First is a follow-up to pin you down on an answer to one of you gave to one of Councillor Gunther's questions. On the practical side of things, is it as easy implementing a clean air zone? Is it as easy as looking up someone's registration and working out whether their vehicle will fulfil the criteria of being low emissions? I wondered on has any research been done on firstly the regional centre, but also other town centres and areas which are affected by too high levels of nitrous oxide, as to the contribution made by Class C vehicles versus normal cars and the sort that our constituents would tend to use? And finally, on the presentation, it was said that local authorities must consider introducing charging clean air zones unless they can identify alternatives that are at least as effective at reducing nitrous oxide. Are there any other systems that are realistically going to do that other than clean air zones?
So to kind of deal with those in reverse, that's the exam question. In effect, that we're grappling with at the moment. Clearly, a charging clean air zone has a very immediate impact. What we are looking to make sure is that as we approach the final set of decisions around this, that local authorities and then the combined authority collectively are allowed to weigh up that decision against a broader policy impact. So taken at face value, it's hard to find other measures that achieve the same so quickly. But there are broader based policy questions that clearly local authorities have to consider before reaching that conclusion. In terms of incremental impact, yes, absolutely. Part of the analysis at the moment that we're working on with government around building agreement on the modelling system is to is to look at the incremental impact of each vehicle type on the air quality problem that we have in different locations within Greater Manchester, and obviously that does vary. You will find a greater proportion of light goods vehicles in some parts of Greater Manchester than others, to take an example. In terms of the management system, yes, in principle, each vehicle is registered with its engine type at the point of manufacture. And so the DVLA system is the logical way in which any air quality management system of that form would be managed. And government has a process underway at the moment working with local authorities to develop a standard modular model around how that would work in practice. Go on.
Yeah, so you can look up the Euro engine of your car. Yes. And so what we'll do is we can send round that link so you can all put your own registrations in and just let other people see it as well.
Did you want to come back, Councillor Wilson?
On the second point, you said that there were differences between different parts of Greater Manchester and what the issues look like in different boroughs. Yeah. Does that mean that you'd consider a different regime for, say, Oldham Town Centre compared to Manchester City Centre?
So I wouldn't want to go into the specifics of any location at the moment, but yeah, that there are different parts of Greater Manchester that have a very different vehicle mix. We have a good handle on that as TFGM through the data that we collect every year and through the models that we maintain, and that means that we can model with a reasonable degree of confidence what would be the differential impact of applying measures to different types of vehicles in different locations.
Councillor Birch, please. I've got on my list Councillors Birch, Whittam, Walker and Councillor Gunther wanted to come back again. I'm going to draw a line under that because we've got other things to do. But Councillor Birch, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is in relation to funding. Any project, obviously, we can have plans and aspirations. Unless there is funding, we can't implement much. And on page 40, you talked that we would apply for clean air funding. Because the time is of the essence, we have to comply with legal requirements and we have to implement it very quickly, whenever the plan is going to be approved and that. I was just wondering whether when we apply for funding to the central government, when we receive it, however much, whether we will have a strategy how to distribute it across the different cities, different councils, and what the criteria would be. Is it the size? Is it how much pollution there is? How many high pollution zones there are in the cities? Because it is an emotive subject, isn't it? And I guess it makes sense to have it all in place when we get the funding to quickly implement then the plan.
Absolutely. So within the business case, we'll have a financial case and a management case that will set out how we would go about managing our funds within the plan within Greater Manchester. Government will absolutely require us to prioritise the funding against the problem, and so we'll need to be able to demonstrate that. I think the other point that Councillor Gunther and also the Mayor have been raising with government is we need to make sure that government has sufficient funds set aside in the first place. And so we've been making sure that that joint air quality unit that I talked about before, that those officials understand the kinds of scales of cost that we could be talking about from this point onwards, so that they can be advising into ministers early. But that will be an absolutely critical component in terms of ensuring that any plan is deliverable in practice.
We've also been lobbying across the city regions on this because we share a common problem. And one of the, if you have funding for a particular area but not other areas, it might result in some perverse behaviour. So what we don't want, for example, is stringent measures taken, for example, in Birmingham and Leeds, which means that fleet owners there move their dirtier vehicles to Greater Manchester, which would make the air quality problem worse here, not better. So in parallel to all of this, we are working very, very closely with other city regions in terms of our lobbying of government to make sure that we have this strategic approach to air quality, because we should be working to the same aim, and we should be careful that government don't have ad hoc solutions to different areas which cumulatively don't deal with the issue.
Councillor Whittam, please.
Yeah, you mentioned about the £3 million worth of funding being used toward installation of more electric car charging points. I just wondered what evidence there is out there that might help drive more people to purchase electric vehicles, and then also wondered whether there's scope within this work to consider the subsidising of purchasing electric vehicles, and whether the cost of doing that has been assessed and looked into.
So there is evidence that the fact that we've taken a lead as Greater Manchester over the past 5 years, and that we've already had the electric vehicle charging network in place, that has helped to be an incentive for the uptake of electric vehicles. As we know, there are a proportion of households in Greater Manchester where it's perfectly feasible to have a domestic point at home for charging. There are a lot of households in Greater Manchester where that doesn't work as a feasible alternative. So we're wanting to make sure that there's a network out there that's flexible enough for different residents in Greater Manchester. I also ought to stress that early measures fund activity is just the first next step that we want to undertake around electric vehicles. The Mayor at the Green Summit made clear that he is looking to double the size of our electric vehicle network by the end of the decade. We are currently awaiting government's confirmation on how it will go about mobilising a much larger electric vehicle funding programme that was highlighted in the budget last year, but we're still awaiting detail around, unfortunately. And at the same time, we're starting the process of reletting the management contract for the Greater Manchester electric vehicle network, so that we're in a good position to be able to move at pace and at a considerably greater scale over the next couple of years on EV charging. and there's good evidence to suggest now that the market is rising quickly. There are waiting lists for the most popular electric vehicles now, and that's a very, very positive sign. And it is just an inescapable fact that an electric vehicle is a zero emitting polluter when it comes to nitrogen oxide on our streets. So.
Councillor Walker, please.
Sorry. One of the problems that I have is with the public participation. And the dilemma I have is, a few years ago, no one cared a toss about plastic. You know, so what? You know, it's not, now it's a serious issue for most people. So really, they get it. They've seen the picture of the whales choking on plastic, all the rest of it, what it's like under some of our seas. I'm concerned that when we start dealing with this issue in terms of public participation, we finish up in a situation where the emotive stuff about the little taxi driver who's got a horrible diesel that's absolutely wrecking the area is being victimised, and he operates in a poor area, and I just think that we have to be preemptive about this. We have to start sowing the seeds. We have to, I'm quite sure if we've got 2,000 deaths a year in Greater Manchester, I can think of, as I drive through Salford and onto the M60, and that queue every night along there, and all those poorish neighbourhoods around there, I'm quite sure there'll be loads of people, and I'm being emotive now, but seeing some of the people who are suffering with respiratory problems directly related to where they live starts the people thinking in a different way. And I do think that if we don't do that early doors, afterwards is always second best. So I really think we've got to do, you know, if we're going to consult the public, don't consult them and then tell them afterwards that you got it wrong. Make sure that the message is out there, and we have to be very professional about getting that message out. I'm guessing that most of us are environmentalists of some sort. We care about our environment, but we also care about our towns and all the other things. So I'm very keen on that. And just because the other thing that I seem to remember last time we talked about this issue was the issue about motorways being excluded. And also the issue, and I know it's something that Andy's raised at least once on the television, about taxis, because we all know that the easiest way to get a taxi that might be underperforming is to register it in a certain district just outside Greater Manchester and then operate it in Manchester every day. You know, and it's got round all our restrictions. And I do think that, you know, those issues, I don't know if made any progress on them, but we need to, otherwise we'll just have that moving it around effect. And we could easily be the sufferers in this. But we've got to win that hearts and minds battle as part of this exercise.
I'll take those points, and then Simon, if you want to fill in any gaps that there might be. The issue of taxis, absolutely. At the last combined authority meeting, we actually agreed to develop a joint Greater Manchester plan on taxi licensing, covering everything from the environmental concerns around taxis through to public safety, and coming to an agreement on minimum standards across Greater Manchester, because actually, even within Greater Manchester, you can undercut one council by going to another council, from everything in terms of the background of that driver through to the age of the car. Some councils in Greater Manchester mandate age of vehicles, some don't. So I think also if we're going to be lobbying the government to say you should have national standards on taxi licensing and to ensure that you don't have people going to Wolverhampton or Rossendale as the case may be, we need to get our own house in order. And I think that because now this strategy that we've agreed in the combined authority, we're going to consult on, and we aim to have it implemented by the end of 2018. So well in advance of 2021, we aim to have the issue of taxi licensing, including the environmental standards of taxis, sorted. That's not going to be easy. All I'm saying is the timescale for that is shorter than for other areas. You make a really, really good point about victimisation, and this is something that we are really going to have to focus on in terms of the public consultations. The first public consultation is likely to be a general consultation on the issue and raising public understanding of what you're talking about. Later consultations will be more specific about solutions. But you're absolutely right. How do we raise public awareness of the impacts of air pollution on our communities in a way that doesn't point the finger at people? I'm not giving you an answer today because I don't actually have a clear answer to that, but that's something that we need to focus on. And if you look at things like the age of vehicles, well, actually, if you're really rich, the likelihood is you have a newer vehicle and you are more likely to comply with this, and therefore if we have a charging zone, you are not going to be charged even though you have most ability to pay. Whereas if you are poorer, are you likely to have an older vehicle? Are you more likely to be impacted on this? If you are, then we need to be progressive and inclusive about this, and it's incumbent on us as councils to provide adequate support to those people and raise the issue with government to make sure that they provide that support. Because actually this is about inclusion. It's about making sure that people most affected by air quality are helped, but we also can't affect people. So when we talked about minimising the impact on the local economy, actually by local economy we mean people's individual economic well-being as well. That's the real challenge, and we'll probably come back to you and talk to you about some of this messaging. Now, for the past couple of years, we've in National Clean Air Day, which has happened in June, TFGM have produced some fantastic videos very much about children and the effects of air quality on their lungs because they're most prone to these conditions. They're the sorts of things that we are going to have to ramp up and increase that concern about. And the other thing is that unlike smog in the 1950s, this is invisible. Nitrogen dioxide is invisible. You cannot see this problem. So how do we make people aware of that? We need to focus on that. And the third broad area he talks about is motorways, which is a really, really good point because much of the issue in Greater Manchester in terms of poor air quality relates to the M60. And the M60 is the responsibility of Highways England, not individual councils. So what's generating quite a lot of this poor air quality is in effect out of our hands. And we are lobbying government on this issue to say that Highways England have to be part of this solution and have to be part of the bodies that we work with, because quite frankly, without their involvement, without their engagement, it's going to be very, very difficult to address this. And if you look, we dealt with this when we last brought this to scrutiny, if you look at some of those pockets around Greater Manchester where we have this poor air quality, you don't need to be an expert to identify that it relates to the M60. And coming back to your point earlier, Councillor Wilson, about how it affects different areas of Greater Manchester differently, I'll give you two examples. The driver of poor air quality in the city centre is predominantly people travelling to the city centre. The driver of poor air quality in my borough, the biggest area of concern is the A34 between Cheadle Royal, where John Lewis and Sainsbury's is, and the junction of the M60 at Gatley. The driver of that traffic is vehicles going through the A34 to get onto the M60. So how we solve those different sorts of drivers of poor air quality will require a very sophisticated approach, and that's what we're going to be looking at over the next few months. But it's going to be very, very difficult, and I think you've made a really good point there about how we make sure that we take the public with us. If you talk about clean air charging zones, if it's a big if, we go ahead with them, the aim of them is to not raise a penny. Because if drivers think, yeah, all right, it's a bit of a pain, but I'm happy to pay the charge, That's a complete failure. It solves nothing. So the aim of clean air charging is to avoid people paying the charge, as opposed to congestion charging, where actually you probably do want to. Where it's a different thing. That's about charging people for the damage and the congestion that they cause. This is about not having those vehicles there in the first place. So that's what we're grappling with at the moment, and over the next couple of months we'll be able to talk to you more substance about it once we've firmed up some of this work.
Yeah, but the tear-jerking works.
If you say so.
Was there anything else? I'm going to wrap that up. Thank you, Councillor Walker. You've made that point very, very well. Was there anything else to come back on that? Okay, Councillor Gunther, because you've been on once already, please be brief, and then we'll move on.
Yes, I will be quick, Chair. Right, just a practical point, really. I'm going back on the charging mechanism. You've told us, Simon, that the DVLC know how many new vehicles, and they must do, because it comes right when you get your notification and so on. So they obviously know how many vehicles haven't, all before that date. So you're going to be charging some of them. Has any thought been given to how the charges are going to be, and I do take your point, how the charges are going to be implemented, and isn't that going to be really quite a big issue or problem or whatever?
We're looking at options at the moment. It's a bit early for me to describe those to you, and as Councillor Gunther says, you know, this is still an if at the moment. We are still looking at options at the moment. I must stress, I haven't come to you to set out a plan yet. I've only come to advise you on the range of options that we're looking at.
Okay, that wraps up nicely. We would certainly welcome you back when you do have a plan. The timetable is in here, and so I think we'll leave it to you to work out when the right time would be for you to come to us. We as a committee are keen to see things before they go to the Combined Authority for decision, and so please bear that in mind. Please work with Susan on and Jude. Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, item 6, GMSF Transport Study and Evidence Base.
Okay,
again, Simon, I think.
It's me again, but I think you've heard enough from me for the moment. So I'm going to introduce my colleague Mia Crowther, who's going to take you through the slides that we circulated. Just before Mia takes you through that, I thought it was probably worth just setting the scene. Over the last couple of years, two big areas of policy development in Greater Manchester have come together through the work that we're going to describe here. So back in February of last year, we published the 2040 Transport Strategy, and of course work has been underway that the committee is well aware of around the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. Clearly, the spatial framework in its broadest sense, so not just those specific locations, but the overall picture of population growth, housing growth, economic growth in Greater Manchester is a great opportunity, but an opportunity that we need to be able to support in the right way through the right connectivity plan over time. What Mia's going to take you through now is how the teams have come together both at a Greater Manchester level and at a local authority level to properly understand the transport issues associated with growth in Greater Manchester, and to make sure that as we now make our pitch to government for funding under the next government spending round, that the initiatives that we're pitching for best help and support and complement the growth agenda in Greater Manchester, so we can continue to ensure that we can achieve the growth, in a way that fits with the kind of sustainable issues that we talked about before, and that extends opportunities to all across Greater Manchester. So with that context, I'll hand over to Mia.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to run through a few sort of key elements of the work that we're doing at the moment. So I'll give you an overview of the key documents that we're working on, outline the timeline for the work. Two of the key documents are a transport study, which is divided into 2 parts, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. I'll also bring to the table a bit of information about the pipeline process and how that works through with this project, and talk a little bit about modelling and analysis. So this diagram sort of sets out the key documents and how they relate to some of the supporting work that we've got underway. So across the top there are sort of 5 main areas. The GMSF transport study is divided into 2 parts, like I said. The first part really looks at the issues that are prevalent across Greater Manchester regarding growth and housing and employment growth and population growth. The second study looks to address those issues. So what sorts of things could we do to help the transport network deal with that increase in population, employment and housing? Alongside that, the GMCA team are producing a portfolio of sites, concept plans, master plans, that actually look at the detailed transport implications at a local level, while TFGM are actually looking at the strategic impact of the combined growth across the area. So we'll be doing some strategic modelling and analysis with some of the clever modelling tools that we have available to us. And that links actually to some of the work that the districts will be doing at a more local level, so looking at the impact at a more on the local network in a bit more detail. And then finally, at the end of that chain of documents, there is the delivery plan of the 2040 transport strategy. So as Simon said, we've already written an overarching transport strategy for GM, and every year we will be preparing there's already a 5-year delivery plan. So we're writing a new delivery plan that ties in the work of the GMSF and the other aspirations across GM. So in the supporting documents, there's a whole range of work that's gone on. We've undertaken a refresh of the transport evidence base. There is a progress report that is due to be completed quite soon. We're doing sub-strategies on different themes. And a lot of this work also will feed into something that GMCA will produce, which is an overarching infrastructure delivery plan for the GMSF itself. So I'll go through a few of the elements of these main key documents in the rest of the presentation. So in terms of timelines though, we're currently looking at we're doing the final edits to the Part 1 and Part 2 reports. The concept planning work is underway with all the districts. We've done some early iteration work of some of the modelling, and we're partway through writing the 5-year delivery plan. In October, the consultation draft of the GMSF will come to the GMCA for approval, and the intention is that in parallel with that, there will be the 5-year delivery plan and the transport study published all at the same time, so that people will be able to see how the GMSF has been underpinned by some of the transport work that has gone on. So the consultation period will be November to January, with analysis in February, April next year, and a second consultation period to the middle of next year, with a GMSF submission not in the spring as it says there, actually December 2019, January 2020, so right on the cusp of the end of next year. So the Part 1 study work that we've undertaken so far has really delved into the issues around transport of growth in housing and employment. The methodology we used is that we divided Greater Manchester into 6 study areas, and we held workshops with all the districts and our partners such as the HE and neighbouring authorities to identify the key transport issues in each study area. That was then collated together in order to understand the broad impact across GM, so that it'll be building from the ground up, essentially, that knowledge base about what the problems and issues are with transport and how that would relate to the growth areas potentially identified in the GMSF. As part of that process, we were updating our evidence base as well. So the following slides are really kind of just a way of encapsulating those key issues at the different levels of travel that we have across Greater Manchester. I don't know how many people are familiar with the actual strategy that we have, the the transport strategy, but it's divided into neighbourhoods, wider city region, city regional centre work, and effectively each of these layers relates to a different type of travel. So I'll go through each one and explain a little bit more, but in terms of connected neighbourhoods, we're talking about the journeys that they're small journeys. So when you put an image on a plan of GM, there's a lot going on there. But actually, really, in summary, though, there's the main issues that came out of this work at a district level is that there's a high proportion of short trips made by car, so trips under 2 kilometres. The access to local centres on foot and by bike is something that needs to be addressed and improved. We have issues of severance caused by busy roads and lack of crossing points. And the form and design of new development in the local network needs to be very integrated and connect to the existing infrastructure. So that's sort of the key things for the connected neighbourhoods. Then the second level up is travel across the wider city region. So they're all those trips that we take that don't go into the city centre and don't go out of GM, but they're a bit longer than 2 kilometres. So they're the trips that we're more likely to use a car for potentially, or we'd be more dependent on public transport to make those slightly longer trips.
Sorry, Mia, just on this slide, I couldn't quite work out what was going on with the arrows and the lines. If you were able to spend just 30 seconds explaining for me, that would be really useful.
Sorry.
And sorry to interrupt you when you're in full flow.
No, that's fine.
But I'm also mindful of time, and I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for member questions.
Sure. So each of the it's kind of colour-coded, essentially. So the arrows and the lines just illustrate the key areas where this is an issue. So for example, traffic congestion on key roads, that's a sort of an illustration of the number of key roads that we have that are important to the network across GM with the purple lines. And then the car being dominant mode for travel across the wider city region, there was a particular issue about travel between the town centres being dominated by car. So essentially those red arrows kind of just illustrate that the sort of general issue about car domination across wider city region trips. The existing public transport network, which needs enhancement in coverage and capacity, isn't actually shown on the plan because it's across the board. It applies across the whole of GM. And then local highway impacts arising from major new strategic highway infrastructure. So those green arrows actually allude to some of the work we're doing with Highways England and Transport for the North that looks at improving connectivity around the northwest quadrant of the M60 and across the Pennines. So it's very, very much an illustrative diagram, just as a way of kind of, rather than having a bullet point list of, of issues. So then the next theme relates to getting into and across and around the regional centre. So the focus on the regional centre that we have with the transport network, and particularly public transport network. So public transport access from the communities furthest away from the central area, supporting economic growth while holding traffic levels at or below the volumes within the city centre, which is an aspiration that was already set out in the 2040 strategy. Critical heavy and light rail constraints in the city centre, in the regional centre. This actually refers to how our network in many cases, comes to a point in the central area, and actually there's a limit to how many vehicles you can move through, how many trams or trains can actually get through that central point. So it acts as, in some cases, acts as a bit of a bottleneck for transport connections across the wider city region. And then congestion on radial corridors and the inner relief routes, which I'm sure everybody's very familiar with on their day-to-day movement around Greater Manchester, which not only affects people who are driving, but it also affects the bus network and delivery vehicles and the like. So then at the next spatial theme that the 2040 strategy looks at, this refers to city-to-city links, but what this really means is travel out of GM and across GM between different places beyond our boundaries. So the resilience, reliability and speed and capacity of some of our strategic road network has been raised as an issue. The need to ensure good public transport access to HS2 and Northern Powerhouse rail services, apologies for the acronyms, across GM. Again, this is an issue that is coming to the forefront as we work with HS2 and Northern Powerhouse partners in improving the infrastructure to actually get to those hubs that will be created in the long term. And then insufficient capacity for high frequency and long distance rail services. Again, that relates to some of the bottlenecks we've got on the network and the demand for such services going up. A globally connected city. So the focus of this is really access to Manchester Airport and access to the port and the Port of Liverpool. So again, reliability and resilience of port access and long distance freight, all very much related to the strategic road network, and public transport access to Manchester Airport in the context of major growth at Manchester Airport, both for the number of flights and as an employment destination. So finally, there's a whole series of issues that don't actually relate specifically to those themes. These Greater Manchester-wide issues apply across the board, really. We've obviously been talking about local air pollution and carbon emissions as part of the clean air work. But there are other issues such as the accessibility and affordability of public transport, lack of integration of public transport networks, safety and security, movement and place demands on a street. So some of our streets, they have different roles in different places. Some streets are very important for a sense of community and local shops and people accessing and using those spaces and having good public realm. Other streets are more important as a thoroughfare for vehicles. Few other issues, severance caused by some of the major strategic infrastructure, so motorways and ship canals, the need to exploit our opportunities for using new technology to improve the transport network, urban logistics and distribution, and ongoing maintenance requirements. So finally, the sort of network resilience and reliability as a whole. So these slides kind of just are, in essence, a summary of the discussions that we had with all the district officers and local partners. And then the part one, sorry if I'm taking too long, the part one report summarises all those into a series of critical issues for Greater Manchester. These are then fed through into the part two report. So things like local neighbourhood connections, creating sustainable towns and sustainable locations, reducing the reliance of the car on for movement across the wider city region and orbital connections. So there's a whole series of those that we've then fed through into the part two report. So that encapsulates an overview of the critical issues. It describes some of the interventions that would be necessary in each study area to address those issues. looks at the phasing of those interventions, so early, late, post-plan in relation to the GMSF, maps those interventions where possible, and then has those outputs which feed into the 5-year delivery plan. And the delivery plan, as I said, will be published alongside the GMSF in autumn. It will encapsulate a whole series of work programmes that are underway, from GMSF, HS2, bus reform, cycling and walking interventions, public health, congestion, clean air, streets for all. The delivery plan is our public-facing document which describes what we will be doing in the short term and what we will be planning for in the long term. So there will be a series of maps that accompany the delivery plan and the Part 2 report, which plan out some of the interventions that are necessary to address the issues in the early, late and post-plan period, and there'll be a commentary about those interventions. That will then feed into a pipeline process.
I wouldn't go into all those right now.
No, I won't do. So, but needless to say, there is a process that sits behind this work. And then this all links through to the delivery plan, which will be an aspirational document with a bold approach, with a clear programme for short-term and long-term planning, which will be updated annually. So it'll be a 5-year plan that rolls, so the next 5 years will add a year each year. Very briefly, just in terms of modelling and analysis, there is a programme of work that will look at the strategic impact of growth. So it will look at the growth in the areas, the existing areas, in the new allocations, and see how that affects the network as a whole. There is a separate process that looks at the detail and the local impact. And with that, we'll be trying to, with this modelling process, we will feed that back through to the GMSF team who are looking at the site allocations, and this will all be part of the picture when, after the consultation goes ahead. Again, this just shows how the modelling process is done iteratively in line with the GMSF work. So we'll be looking to inform the next publication draft. And that was it. Sorry if I was too slow in the first bit.
It's quite encouraging when we get officers who clearly care a lot about their portfolio coming and want to tell us all of the stuff about their portfolio. Thank you very much indeed. I'll start the questions. One, you talk about phasing, which if I read it correctly is like early part, middle part, towards the end. One of the things that residents talk to us about when we're talking about large-scale housing development is sequencing rather than phasing. So does the transport come before the houses are ready to be lived in? Does the transport come many years down the line when everybody's very sad about the congestion that they're living with? So I wonder if you could spend a moment on that and the role that's playing. But also, Streets for All, I wonder actually if the committee would like to know more about Streets for All, and it might be something that's not right for today, but that actually comes in a bit more detail to a future committee meeting. So sequencing and Streets for All from me, please.
I'd really welcome the opportunity to bring Streets for All back. In an absolute nutshell, it's about how do we start to look at corridors, a little bit as we did with Oxford Road here in the city centre, for example, and start to think about some parts of corridors are better placed for public transport and cycling, which is what we've done through the core Oxford Road corridor, while as other parts of a corridor are better placed for general traffic, which is what we did with Upper Brook Street, for example. And it's about starting to take more of that sort of balanced approach, so we're not always having a fight between every travel mode, all for the same bit of street. In terms of sequencing, absolutely, it's a fundamental issue. Actually, a large part of it comes down to funding, and that's the conversation that we're having with government at the moment. So the more that we can secure confidence over a sizable long-term funding arrangement for transport in Greater Manchester, the more that we can invest it with confidence in advance of development. The more that we are having to deal with reduced funding pots, the more that you're always having to address the immediate problem rather than trying to get ahead in terms of the challenge. The other issue that we're working with planning colleagues on then is how do we use that as an incentive for housing developers to deliver at a faster rate. Because clearly a housing development with 2,000 homes on it is potentially a development that we can develop some really good sustainable transport solutions around, but not so much if it's 100 homes a year over 20 years, because you don't get to a critical mass quickly enough within the development. So that's going to be part of the challenge going forwards.
Councillor Morgan, you caught my eye first.
Thank you. I mean, you just touched on it then, because the problem we have, those of us that sit on planning committees and stuff like that, are not the strategic developments, because it's the smaller developments of 30, 40, 50 houses, and there doesn't seem any ability for us to look at them accumulatively. So like 3 or 4, 50 development houses has a massive impact on a major road through somewhere like West Orton, for instance. So this seems to be a very strategic document, and it was only once mentioned connection with the existing infrastructure. And we're constantly firefighting locally. It's the biggest problem, and staying with Wigan, is these smaller developments. Because yes, it might take 10 years, but all those coming together, you come to gridlock. And we've done no infrastructure improvements. So I hope that we can somehow put some sort of, through the GMSF, put some upper limit type levels and say this, without any real infrastructure development within this area, the maximum it can take is so many houses. And that influences the GMSF, because we don't have the ability to change smaller towns like Falmouth, West Orton, Kearsley, stuff like that. And there has to be a limit. It's not just obviously transport, it's education, it's health. But I'm hoping we can put some sort of limits, and then we as planners can use that to prevent gridlock basically across these smaller areas.
It's a really valid point, and actually one of the benefits, I hope, of the approach that we've taken, because it's a broadly strategic approach that we've taken. So by cutting up the conurbation into the 6 parts that we did, and we did that purposefully because we didn't just want to look at the conurbation district by district, because it's not necessarily the way that people move around the place. What it allows us to do is to understand that cumulative impact over time. Actually, it's one of the great advantages of undertaking the spatial framework, that we're looking over a longer period of time at scale, and therefore we can understand cumulative impact on networks. So what it does allow us to do is to look at that principal trunk road, for example, through a northwest study area, for example, look at something like the East Lancs and understand if there are a series of developments around a corridor like that over time, or the Bolton-Wigan corridor. What does that look like in aggregate? Because clearly through the individual planning process, which of course is absolutely within the remit of individual authorities, you're only looking at any one development at any one moment in time. So you end up with an evidence base, and you end up with a plan here that adds that up over time and helps to identify what we need locally and the development community to contribute to, that solves the problem at a network level rather than just at an individual development level.
Councillor Gunther.
One of the most regular complaints I have brought to our surgery is that of transport, and certainly being in a semi-rural type area. Yeah, I know an awful lot of written word is being devoted to transport and so on. But the thing is, I find, as you will well know, we had a situation in, and I'm sure I'm not alone when I say this, where we have bus services being reduced, basically because people aren't using the bus services. And the reason the people aren't using the bus services because, one, it's expensive, and two, the unreliability of it. So, I mean, the real crux to a successful, but I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here, and I know it comes down to economics and so on. But the real answer to getting people back on public transport, or one of them, I would have thought, and especially in the rural areas, is that the public transport is reliable, is that it is affordable, and it is well, it is reliable and it's affordable and it's available. Well, it's available, but that comes in with reliability as well. But I would have thought, but certainly transport in my area is one of the most regular issues that's brought up at surgeries, usually reduction of a bus service.
So I think there are 3 points there, Chair. So firstly, as the Combined Authorities asked us to look at what are the opportunities in utilising the Mayor's new powers around bus to allow us to develop the best possible bus offer for Greater Manchester, and that works underway at the moment. Secondly, there is a funding issue in the middle of this. So good public transport services, affordable public transport services, actually require a degree of public subsidy over the years. What Greater Manchester's benefited from is pretty good settlements around capital funding for our transport system, but we continue to have a problem that in effect we are, I hesitate to say capital rich, but capital better, but certainly revenue poor still, and that's a challenge for us. And that's something that we're talking to government about at the moment as part of what should the right future funding model look like for transport in Greater Manchester. The third element comes down to the Streets for All approach that we talked about before. So what we have to be able to do is to make sure that public transport can pass reliably through pinch points around our transport system, our road system. And the way in which we do that is to have a more rational way in which we organise our road system. That's what we're trying to achieve through the Streets for All approach, which, as I say, Chair, I'd be very happy to bring back more in due course.
Thank you very much. I think we will add that to an item for a future meeting. Members of this committee have had an update on the current situation regarding bus, and I know that it will come to us when the timing is right for us to talk about that in a bit more detail. Councillor Robinson, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's actually a bit of an update. At the previous meeting where you announced before the meeting that the escalator at Bury Metro Link was working, it wasn't. And it is still out of action today. My question is, what a waste of funding when there's been so much money been spent trying to sort that out and it's still not sorted. I want to know what the costs are for that disgraceful, because if the lift is out, as it has been in the past, I have no way of getting to or from Bury because I'd have to go off somewhere else, as in the past I have done, and I've got off at Radcliffe as per instructions from one of the caretakers at Bury. Get off at Radcliffe, buzz somebody, they'll come and they'll order you a taxi, which never happened. And it was pitch black, middle of winter. So I don't find that reliable. I found myself not feeling safe, so I will never do that again. So can we please get the Bury Metro Link escalator sorted once and for all? Thank you.
Yes, I raised it with colleagues immediately after the last time I was at the committee because it was raised with me. Certainly the issue at that point was that we did actually have a functioning escalator. What we had was a degree of antisocial behaviour with people pressing the stop button and it not being remedied quickly enough. That was something that the team were looking at. I'll take it away again and I'll make sure that it is remedied, because Councillor Robinson's observation, Councillor Gunther's raised the issue with me as well. Yeah, the observations are absolutely right. We need to make sure that we've got an escalator that not only is functioning but is actually running for our passengers. So I will take it away again, absolutely.
Councillor Robinson asked about cost.
Yeah. I'm happy to look into what's the most appropriate way of us explaining costs of escalators. I'm assuming that the committee isn't suggesting that the investment in an escalator at the interchange is the wrong thing. It is clearly the right thing. I think the issue is around operational control of escalators in those facilities less than cost, but I'm happy to look into that.
I'll let Councillor Robinson explain herself.
This was promised a while back because obviously the lift was always going to be out of order on and off. And then when the escalator went up as well, and this has been going on since last year. And we were told, well, it's going to be done then, it's going to be done then, and it's just months went on and on and on, and the escalator was still out. Even when I went home last time, young lady got off who was pregnant with a suitcase, not knowing that the escalator was out. Tried to get up it. In the end, 4 men had to help her up on the escalator with her suitcase. And this is a heavily pregnant young woman who didn't know there was a lift. And by the time I'd got off the tram, I couldn't get to her to tell her there was a lift. So there's poor signage as well. And it's all barricaded off at the moment. And I want to know, what are the costs involved on replacing what was supposed to have been replaced months ago, and why we are still having a problem, and have the costs gone over?
Are you going to take that away and come back to us, please? Because Councillor Robinson's absolutely right. She's certainly not the only passenger who will be affected by this. And you make a good point, Simon. We should have both functioning and running escalators. Good. As nobody else has indicated that they have a question, I will thank you very much for that. I'll move us on. We're just asked to note on item 9 the register of key decisions. Hopefully they are noted. Very good. Item 10, the work programme. Susan's got a piece of paper with quite a lot going on there. Do you want to update us, Susan, please?
Yeah, hello. Thanks very much, Chair. We're in quite an iterative stage of the work programme. For your September meeting, we've been speaking with the Cycling and Walking Commissioner. Given that you've only just recently had an update on cycling and walking, we possibly feel that it might be better to schedule it slightly later, possibly in conjunction with the Streets for All work, because it feels that Streets for what? The Streets work, I can't remember the proper title. November's meeting is incredibly, October's meeting is incredibly congested. Got a couple of suggested proposals for you to consider. Well, firstly, the GMS 6-monthly update is now going to be ready in November. That's because data will be coming in quite late because it's a 6-monthly update and it won't be ready in time. It will be going to the Combined Authority in November, so you will see it before the Combined Authority considers it. It's proposed that the rail station devolution update, it's not particularly time sensitive. We know the committee are interested in it. I understand from colleagues from TFGM that actually timetabling issues have been more the focus of rail rather than rail station devolution. So proposing that gets moved forward, but that would leave you with a housing vision strategy and a homelessness update, which obviously you were interested in previously, and perhaps a short bus reform update just to ensure that the committee are continue to be involved. Then we were talking about whether or not the committee have any particular ideas that they would like to propose for the agenda. There are obviously certain key things that we would very much like you to look at, but there is scope for the committee to start thinking about issues that they feel are important. And so I don't know whether...
One of the things that I've thought about, which isn't time sensitive, but looking at future transport. So looking at innovation in transport and how we're going to be travelling in 20 years, 30 years, driverless cars being an obvious example. And I think that would be a good thing for us to have a look at as we look at, we have oversight of transport, we look at strategy. I think maybe dedicating some time looking at those sorts of issues would be a good thing to do. The other thing I'm keen to do as well is, while our officers do a really good job of coming in and briefing us, sometimes it's useful to hear from people who are not on the payroll and to see what we should be thinking about and different ways of looking at things. So campaign groups, think tanks maybe, different people who look at things in a different way. So putting those together. Susan's point about the committee thinking about what it would like to look into, there are some obvious spaces in the new year, so January, February, March. Please do have a think, please do get in touch with Susan if there's a particular issue that's not already on there or that we haven't looked at already and that you think it's worth spending our time on it. Please do. Okay, date and time of next meeting, Thursday the 13th of September. Thank you very much, everyone.